course, mountain gorillas live in large family groups that usually consist of about 20 to 30 individuals, but there's always one dominant male, and that is the silverback, and he can be about up to 50 years old. And of course, he keeps that position for many years. Another thing about the mountain gorilla is despite the fact that they're probably no bigger than me, they're a lot stronger than a fully grown man. People who work with them have actually proven that they're 10 times stronger than humans, as they've seen them bend iron bars. But also, another thing about them is that although they are herbivores, they're built like a massive wrestler. And of course, they also have enormous canine teeth, but those don't serve any purpose at all for feeding. They're purely for fighting and for defense. And gorillas are fiercely loyal, and they will fight to the death to defend their families. And that can be from other massive mountain gorillas through to their natural predators like leopards, crocodiles, and even potentially chimpanzees. But unfortunately, in our days, the mighty silverbacks are not just putting their lives on the line to fight off leopards, crocodiles, and chimpanzees. Today, they are facing human foes, and the strength of the silverback is unable to fight off the poacher's bullets. Of course, the hunting of gorillas is illegal throughout their range, but poaching of gorillas is still a massive problem, because gorillas are hunted for sport, but also for the bushmeat trade, and for their body parts to be sold as ornaments. And quite often, when adult gorillas are killed, their young are stolen from the wild to be sold as exotic pets to disreputable zoos, to a rich man's private collection, to a circus, or even for tourists to have their photos taken with. But it's not just poaching that is affecting the gorillas. In fact, gorillas are also susceptible to the deadly Ebola virus, just like humans, and it's actually believed that disease has wiped out a third of the gorilla population in the last 30 odd years. But while there are only about 700 to possibly 1,000 left in the wild, there is hope, because Rwanda and Uganda have found a way to protect gorillas with tourism, tracking them down with cameras rather than guns. But unfortunately, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there's still civil war going on, it's very unlikely that the gorillas are as protected as they should be. But in places like Rwanda and Uganda, tourists come from all over the world to see mountain gorillas. Of course, when you go and see them, you have to follow some very important rules, which are, first one is wearing a face mask, because gorillas are so closely related to humans. They're also susceptible to our diseases. Like, even a simple cold could prove fatal to a massive silverback. So you have to wear a face mask to stop the spread of any diseases, but also you need to leave food behind, or leave anything that could be of any potential danger to the gorillas themselves. But also you can only see them for at least 1 hour, which is a strict rule that minimises disturbance to their secret lives. Of course, this is the range of the mountain gorilla. Now, the next animal I'm going to show you is one of Africa's most dramatic birds of prey. It is the African fish eagle. Now, African fish eagles are one of the most dramatic birds of prey found in Africa, and they're actually so good at hunting that they only have to do it for 10 minutes a day. Of course, as their name suggests, they do feed on fish. In fact, using eyesight that's 8 times more powerful than ours, what they do is they scan the surface to see if there's a fish at the surface, then they will skim along, throw their legs forward and stab with those ferocious talons into the fish. And of course, they don't just eat fish, but they will also hunt birds as big as flamingos, as well as turtles, terrapins, and even small crocodiles. Of course, African fish eagles mate for life, and they will usually have about 2 chicks, and they'll raise them for a few months until they're ready to fly, and then they will teach them how to hunt. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the African fish eagle can tackle prey can tackle birds as big as flamingos, which I think is absolutely incredible. Because those are very big birds, but even so, a bird of that size can take on a flamingo is incredible. And of course, while they are some of the most impressive birds of prey, and as I mentioned, they only have to hunt for about 10 minutes a day. They are not endangered. There's thousands of them across Africa. Of course, wherever there's water, you quite often see African fish eagles, so they're not rare, but they are quite a common sight among African waterways. Here is much of their range. Now, the next animal I'm going to show you all is the Salton of Stealth. It is the leopard. Now, African leopards are one of the most elusive animals in Africa. In fact, they're probably Africa's most elusive and secretive cat. And a fully grown male can grow to be just over 1.5 meters in length, can have canine teeth as long as my index finger, and of course they are the masters of stealth. And of course, leopards are opportunists, so they hunt pretty much anything they can find. In fact, they hunt antelope, wildebeest, zebras, occasionally buffalo, as well as warthogs and baboons. Of course, the most dangerous prey they will take is warthogs, because they are far from defenceless with vicious tusks, and warthogs can and do kill leopards. Of course, leopards do most of their hunting at night, where their stealth and eyesight that's 6 times more powerful than a human's give them the advantage. Of course, their prey, like impala, have a very, very keen sense of smell and hearing, but they don't have very good night vision, and that's what allows the leopard to creep up on them like a thief in the night. Of course, for a leopard and its prey, that's not just hide and seek, it's life or death. And at night time, when leopards are hunting, what they do is they have to place each foot down very, very carefully, and they even control their breathing. And then, once they've got to within no more than 5 meters of their prey, boom! They pounce. And of course, also they will either finish it off with a bite to the throat or the back of the neck. And of course, once this animal has made a kill, it has the strength and agility to hold a carcass up into the trees when no other predator, especially lions and lions and hyenas can get to it. In fact, that's a crafty manoeuvre that allows the leopard to enjoy her meal in peace and undisturbed. Of course, if a leopard is hunting during the day, they usually use their sandy, spotted coats to just disappear in amongst the long grass. And like all cats, leopards are solitary, with the exceptions of mothers and cubs. She'll quite often have 3 cubs, which she will look after for about 2 years. And of course, she has to not only teach them how to hunt, but also she has to protect them from hyenas, wild dogs, lions, and even baboons. And one way she does that is that leopards don't stay in one place for very long. They always move their dens, so they're always on the move. It keeps their cubs away from predators and means they're less likely to be found. But leopards are actually considered Africa's most dangerous big cats because they're so unpredictable, and of course they have been known to kill more people each year than lions. And that's partly down to the fact that they quite often live near villages, where they can either go for livestock or even occasionally people. And of course, they're very rarely seen. I mean, if you're lucky you see a leopard, you don't hear them coming. But even so, this animal continues to be one of probably Africa's most elusive and secretive cats, as well as one of the most beautiful animals in the world. Of course, here is their range. Now, the next animal I'm going to show you is probably our closest living relative. It is the chimpanzee. Now, chimpanzees are found in the jungles and forests of Central and Western Africa. They live in family groups of about 30 animals, but the largest recorded group was about 150 animals in the Ngorongoro National Park in Uganda. Of course, they quite often communicate with each other through facial expressions and loud vocalizations. They have very big brains, which makes them intelligent, and believe it or not, chimps have also learned to use tools. In fact, they've been documented for many years now, using tools to get food, such as using sticks to fish ants and termites out of their nests, using rocks and logs to crack open tough forest nuts. But also, they have been even observed finding a tortoise and whacking it against the buttress root of a tree to crack it open and get the protein inside. Of course, people often believe that chimpanzees only eat fruit, but they don't just eat fruit. In fact, less than half of a chimp's diet is made up of fruit. In fact, what they actually feed on more often is monkeys, small antelope, bush pigs, and even occasionally rival chimps. Of course, they can be hunters, and in fact their favourite food of all are colobus monkeys. Colobus monkeys are smaller and a lot more agile than a chimp. In fact, they can move on the thinnest of branches. Of course, a heavy chimp can't catch them alone, so they use teamwork. Of course, they all have their own role. There's the driver, who's usually a young chimp, quite new to hunting. His task is simple: climb up underneath the monkeys and flush them out. Then there are the side scarers, also known as the blockers. They're a lot more experienced than the ambusher. Their job is usually to hider on trees either